Hey, good afternoon, class. Welcome in. A rare afternoon edition of our video lecture. We're going to kick off today, and we're going to discuss the origins of Western imperialism. So we're going to get into that. Again, this is a unit that can be defined as being a very brutal unit, a unit that really sheds light on a lot of awful things. And really, one of the goals that we want to look at for this unit is to connect current events going in places like Africa, Southeast Asia, and connect them to the past, which roots back to the days of imperialism. So, with that being said, let's get into our first discussion here. And as you can see in these notes, again, this first image kind of characterizes what we're looking at. This is essentially, again, a depiction of the ivory trade, where you have tons of elephants slaughtered for their tusks. Again, this is something that became very popular in the late 1880s. And then has continued, and as we see now, we see poaching, and we see situations where, again, elephants are still tracked down for their tusks. So, again, kind of a hard image to take a look at. With that being said, we want to get into the first part of this discussion and really kind of look at descending into the heart of Africa. Okay, so understand this. As industrialization took off in Europe during the mid-1800s, new areas of growth and opportunity were being sought after. They essentially, much like they did during the age of Columbus, are starting to look for new areas for acquiring resources. The first place that Europeans began to scope out was within the interior of Africa. During the slave trade, again, Europeans had really only been exposed and explored the coastal regions, with word that Africa was rich in raw materials and natural resources. Expeditions and competitions began to erupt amongst European nations, and they intensified, and they're going to take place for well over 3 decades. Soon, that competition would extend into places like Southeast Asia, Latin America, and Australia. As a result, the era of imperialism was underway. Now, imperialism is defined as the extension of a country's power into new regions for political and economic control, with the key word being economics. A lot of economic incentives for these European nations to dive into places like Africa and Southeast Asia. From 1870 to 1914, reason why 1914 is our cutoff point? Trivia question. That's when World War I starts. So we're looking at 1870 and 1914 here. Several European nations would flex their might into regions with untapped raw materials and natural resources. Once these areas became colonized, European nations would build roads, bridges, schools, and buildings for themselves at the expense of the native populations. Thus began a dark and horrific era of racism and what we call social Darwinism. Now, social Darwinism is a social theory proposed by Charles Darwin that suggests that our world is determined by a survival of the fittest. Okay, Europeans believed that they were superior to all other non-Europeans that they encountered. And this is where we see, again, significant issues of racism. Now, in these new regions, there were 3 types of control. Europeans would typically establish this in their colonies. And the first type of control is what we call a settlement colony. This would be an entirely new area where a particular nation moves full on in. And one example of this would be Great Britain going into Australia, which, if you didn't realize, Australia used to be a prison colony, so they would send prisoners to Australia. Well, again, they start looking around, saying, hey, well, there's some resources here, and they establish a colony in Australia. Next, we have a dependent colony. So a dependent colony is where a few European leaders and business men would lead in a specific area. They're going to lead and rule. An example of this would be British control in India. Okay, this is dependent. And lastly, we have what we call a protectorate. So a protectorate is where European nations would grant local tribal leaders control of their territory while still operating behind the scenes. So they're still pulling the strings. They're still having a say in all the economic decisions. And an example of this would be British control in Kenya. Okay. Now, as all these areas are being set up, we have what we call a sphere of influence. Okay, as nations settle into these various regions across Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, they are setting up a sphere of influence. Well, what is a sphere of influence? Well, again, this is essentially an area that each European nation would carve out for themselves. Okay, at the same time, nationalism, again, proud to be British, proud to be French, proud to be German, over would carry over to these spheres of influence, and of course, you're going to see a lot of anger boil, a lot of intense rivalries. As you can imagine, a chief example here would be the British and the French extending their hatred for one another into Africa, Southeast Asia. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, it's something we've been talking about quite a bit. Now, naval powers and armies were also being built up for defense and precaution in case there was an outbreak of war. Well, in order to prevent war, there was what we call the Berlin Conference of 1885. So this is basically 14 European nations coming together, 1884, 1885. They're going to discuss things. Their tempers are going to subside. They're going to essentially lay the ground rules on the division of Africa. They agreed that any European nation could claim land in Africa as long as they notify other European nations and they show it that they control that area through a map. Little consideration was given to the native African people who were living in these regions. Okay, ethnic and linguistic groups ended up being divided, and this is going to lead to divisions down the road, and it's going to lead to conflicts into the 20th century, even into modern times. A lot of these divisions root back to the Berlin Conference of 1885. Okay, now no African rulers were allowed to meet at this Berlin Conference. By 1914, only Liberia and Ethiopia remained free of European rule. Again, there's a little political cartoon that kind of illustrates. You've got Otto von Bismarck there carving up the cake of Africa and distributing it to all of his European cronies. Okay? So, economic motives. All right, again, with the rise of heavy industry, as you can imagine, European powers are going to have a thirst for raw materials to help fuel and operate all of this machinery. Industrialization led to a boom in production, therefore more and more resources and materials need to be extracted from Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. Industrialists often had the final word when it came to precious goods. So the business folks that get involved, they're the ones that are going to have the final word. This includes diamonds, it includes ivory, it includes rubber, and you're going to see the horrific results of this as it's going to again, decimate African tribes, human greed being put in play to extract these materials. With populations growing, again, the demand for all these products skyrocketed as well. Okay, so understand this. What we have here are European nations moving into the heart of Africa, moving into the coast of Southeast Asia. And you're seeing, as they're moving into these areas, much like we saw in the age of Columbus, just outright racism, okay? And essentially what we're going to look at here is a situation where Europeans felt it was their destiny to fulfill these economic desires during this age of imperialism. Rudyard Kipling, again, a man you guys are probably well aware of, wrote the Jungle Book. You know, you got Baloo, you've got Mowgli, you've got these familiar characters. He wrote a poem in this era also, and this poem was known as The White Man's Burden. In it, he suggested it was necessary to spread white culture to civilize what he called, again, the quote-unquote half-devil, half-beasts who lived in these imperial territories. This poem suggests that it was also the white man's duty to assert power and control. So right off the bat, again, we're seeing clear examples of racism rampant throughout all of these regions. Now, to counter that, we have, there were pro-imperialists and there were anti-imperialists. And Kipling's racism and pro-imperialist writings were countered by a man by the name of Joseph Conrad, who wrote Heart of Darkness, which you might be familiar with. They also made a modern version of it called Apocalypse Now, which came out in 1979. This book suggests that imperialism was only designed to benefit European greed and livelihoods. And that's what it comes down to. Essentially, imperialism was for European economic and political gain. And it was at the cost of those that were living in these regions. All right? As you can imagine, with all of these new regions opening up, you've got missionaries from Christian churches who are starting to spread their beliefs and customs into the imperial colonies as well. And what do we see? We see Christianity flood into the region. We're going to see Islam flood into the region. And you're also going to have competition in terms of religion. And so once again, we're seeing a situation where these religions are telling people of different native indigenous tribes to drop their gods and now all of a sudden accept the Christian God or the Islamic God. And that's what we're seeing throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s. Okay? All right, folks, well, that's a wrap. Enjoy the video lecture. We're going to have a journal log that's going to go along with it, and I will see you on Monday. Take care, everybody. Have a good one.